Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. You should be able to hear me now. I'm Arjuna, and today it's my honor to be hosting this discussion between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Howard Resnick. Matt Dillahunty is well known on the atheist and skepticism scene. He's the host of the Atheist Experience call-in show, and he's the leader of the Atheist Society of Austin, Texas. Dr. Howard Resnick, also known as H.D. Goswami. Dr. Howard Resnick has published, he's been a spiritual leader in a worldwide bhakti-yoga community for over 50 years. He holds a PhD in Sanskrit and Indian Studies from Harvard University. He's published many academic books and articles, including several publications with Harvard University, and has lectured around the world on philosophies of the sacred traditions of India. He has also established bhakti-yoga communities in many countries. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Resnick, who can get us started, and I'll unmute him. All right.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for hosting us, and thank you very much, Matt, for participating.
Glad to be here.
Pleasure to talk with you. And I have often heard in debates that I've watched and listened to, an argument which I wanted to correct, and that was that it's an argument about the approach of religious people to morality. And I've often heard the argument that rather than reason their way to, let's say, good moral principles based on the effect of certain activities on human suffering or human flourishing, that religious people simply tend to accept what's written in a sacred text. And there are people like that. So I wanted to explain this. I'd like to refer to the famous question that Socrates posed to Euthyphro in the dialogue of that name. I mean, I won't get into, is it Plato or Socrates, but anyway, in this dialogue, Euthyphro is basically a very self-righteous guy. He's not righteous, he's self-righteous and somewhat fanatical about his moral principles. So Socrates asks him, are some actions that we perform, are some actions good because the gods love those actions, or do the gods love those actions because they are good? In other words, so it seems to me that people who think that something is moral or immoral without consideration of the effect on real human lives or other forms of life are somewhat fanatically, are sort of the Euthyphros of the world. And I know in my own life, I would argue that, apart from my own life, I would say in terms of the books which I hold sacred, that I'm quite sure that certain actions are enjoined or discouraged or prohibited because they are morally good or bad in the sense of the effect they have on real lives. And rather than, in other words, it's not that certain activities are moral because they're in a text, but rather they're in the text because they're moral. And I know in my own life, because we have, I think in any ancient text, there's all kinds of injunctions which are only make sense within a historical context. For example, in the Bible, there's laws about how to treat your camel, and I actually don't own a camel. So, and other things. I mean, if you look at pre-industrial societies with extended families, agrarian economies, and the extraordinary differences there are between those kinds of societies and industrial and post-industrial societies, and what kinds of activities actually produce human flourishing or suffering. There are universals. I'm not denying that some things are just always wrong no matter what kind of historical economy you have. But I think there are some differences. So for me, some injunctions in the text that I follow clearly are not appropriate for this age. And my teacher, Prabhupada, also taught that there are certain things which are enjoined, which we just don't do nowadays for various reasons. So I believe Matt and I are not too far apart in the sense that I agree with him that we have to reason our way to correct understanding of what really constitutes morally good or bad behavior. And the last thing I'll say on this, because I don't want to go on forever, is that I translated a passage in Sanskrit in an ancient text. Whoops, my phone is dinging. You have to stop them. Yeah. WhatsApp. So a statement by Krishna himself in the Mahabharata, where he teaches that something which you consider truth is not truth if it leads to evil. And similarly, something that you may not consider true is true if it leads to virtue. The common example given in the West is you live in Amsterdam, the Nazis have occupied the city, they come to your door, some Jews are hiding somewhere. You also know that if you lie and say there are no Jews there, that actually the Nazis, because of the circumstances, are not going to find out. Kant says, you tell the truth. Yeah, the Nazis are hiding there. The Jews are hiding there. And there's sort of an identical story in the Mahabharata told by Krishna, where there was a sage who, sorry for going on so long, but there was a sage who was very proud of always answering any question truthfully. And so one time these terrified citizens ran through his forest ashram, pursued by these murderous thieves. And so the citizens hid in the forest, and the thieves came and said, "Did you see some people run through here?" And the sage, thinking he was being very strict in his honesty, said, "Yeah, they're over there." And the criminals found and killed them. And so Krishna said that that sage was so honest that he went to hell, because he sort of mindlessly followed a principle without considering the actual consequences. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I think it is possible to be religious and have a little common sense about moral principles.
So first, I'm sorry, I'm slightly confused, because I thought we were going to have a discussion about epistemology, and now we're having a conversation about morality, which is independent. Like I agree with you. There are plenty of religious people who can exercise and use reason and come to good, reasonable conclusions about how to act. And the story of the sage there, I think I disagree. Sam Harris put out a book called Lying, where he basically argued that nobody should ever lie. That sort of same simplistic notion that the sage is advocating for there. I think the better solution is that if somebody asks me where someone is, I can just refuse to answer the question. And now I'm not lying or telling the truth. I'm just not cooperating. And because that is the more moral of those things. Now, when you talk about something that truth isn't true if it leads to something evil, I find, for me, truth is about whether or not something conforms to the facts of reality. And things like good and evil are assessments that we put on actions with motivations, and that's independent of the truth. So I don't know, I don't think I would consider cancer evil. But if I had cancer, the truth is I have cancer, whether somebody considers it evil or not. And if, for example, I debated David Wood, who's a legitimately diagnosed psychopath who wants to do harm to people. It is true that he is a psychopath who will do harm to people, and people will evaluate that as evil. So, I mean, there's that distinction. I want to make sure, from the outset, irrespective of whether we spend most of our time on epistemological paths, or if we end up talking about morality, I'm not here representing anybody but myself. I'm not representing atheism. There is no such thing as atheist epistemology. There are many views on epistemology and morality that are consistent with someone being an atheist, and I'm willing to accept any claim that can demonstrate its veracity in accordance with my model for epistemology. And that includes any better model that I should be using, because if there was a better model, a better path to truth, that should be demonstrable. So I don't think we're all that. I don't know, because we haven't gone through a catalog of moral positions, but I have no objection to the note that there are probably countless religious people currently and throughout history who have reasoned their way into positions on morality, independent of what the tenets of their religion would have them believe, or whatever holy book that they're going to. So I don't know if I've in the past done something sloppy and said, religious people only know how to follow whatever their book says. Clearly, I was not referring to everybody.
I agree with everything you said, actually, and just quickly, and we'll get to epistemology. Regarding like truth, I mean, of course, I agree with what you said. The truth is the truth. I think, and I was unclear in that. That was my ambiguity, but I think the intention was to say a moral truth rather than like the fact of the matter. So, epistemology.
Yeah.
Truth.
You going to start?
Well, I could say one thing and then turn it over to you, if you don't mind.
Sure, go for it.
I was hoping to focus on the notion of evidence, because one thing I've heard very often in the debates I've watched is the idea that there's no evidence for God. And so I was hoping that we could, from the outset, take off the table things like logical positivism. And I'd just like to read I'll tell you why, one little thing from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy that I wrote down that, and by the way, I know that you know what it is very well, Matt, but for other people, logical was a movement sort of flowered in Vienna in the 1920s, and in which philosophers were trying to be like scientists, and they said that that any type of philosophy or philosophical claim or definition which can't be empirically verified is just sort of meaningless language. And according to the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I won't go into the whole history of its fate, but by 1960, the movement had run its course. Soon, anyway, blah, blah, blah. So by then, neo-positivism, because there were many spin-offs on positivism, which was basically philosophical materialism and empiricism as the only valid way of coming to philosophical truths. That neo-positivism was, quote, dead or as dead as a philosophical movement ever becomes. And the reason I bring that up is because in the discussion of evidence, I hope we are going to move beyond the idea that evidence has to be empirical. I'm not accusing you of holding that position, but I hope we can open up the discussion beyond that.
Well, so first of all, granted, I have no idea whether or not somebody else would count me amongst logical positivists at all, and my views are gradually changing and are my own. I think the closest I've come is Susan Haack had a foundherentism, which was like a combination of foundationalism and coherentism that kind of comes close to what I'm holding. But I wouldn't say that, granted, I am in fact an advocate for empirical evidence, especially for factual claims. Anything that is going to be a claim about the real world, I think should ideally be supported by empirical evidence, but that doesn't mean that you can't reason with regard to definitions, etc. And so my model, some have described it as scientism, and actually I'm fine with scientism as long as it's not an assertion that science is the one and only path to everything that could be considered truth. But if we're talking about how we are going to evaluate claims about the world to find out whether or not they're real, there is an element of scientism that I'm perfectly fine with, because the presuppositions, the base ones that I start with, are things like I have to presuppose reason, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, because you don't have any choice but to presuppose them. You would have to assume they were true to try to prove they were false, and that leads to a problem. I have to have a presupposition that I experience reality, and that this reality is subject to investigation, and that it is sensibly uniform or uniform enough to not be chaotic and immune to investigation, and that my senses are generally reliable. We know they're not perfectly reliable, optical illusions, etc. But the fact that we can show when and how and when and to what extent they're reliable kind of confirms their reliability. And we can tell the difference between like reality and a dream state. And even though I can't tell you which one is the really real, is the reality that I'm experiencing right now, is this the really real reality, or is the dream reality the really real one? as a pragmatic notion, not only do I spend more time apparently in this reality, but it's the one that seems to be uniform and testable. It's like I can never flap my wings or flap my arms and fly here, and yet in a dream world I might be able to do this. And so, even though I can't demonstrate which one's more real, the absurdity of a dream world and the inconsistency of a dream world at least makes it immune to that sort of investigation. And so after those presuppositions, it's just a matter of I value skepticism, and particularly modern skepticism, modern scientific skepticism, which is proportioning my confidence to the evidence. And in some cases, since we're going to talk about evidence, I'm not aware of, like, if you could give an example of a claim that is supported by non-empirical evidence that we should in fact accept, that would be I would be keenly interested in that.
Okay. First, I think I agree with everything you said, which
well, then you're probably right.
So, how to go? My one argument would be as follows. It seems to me that the heart of the empirical method is the controlled experiment and observation. And observation, of course, also entails a certain degree of control, access, sort of, regulated, predictable access to something. And so, for example, well, if someone, let's say, is very powerful in a society and I'm not very powerful and I can't just walk into their house. I mean, to get an interview with that person, to get access to the power to observe that person, I don't have that power. So that's my first point. The empirical method is based on some degree of control of that which you're studying. And therefore, it seems to follow necessarily that the empirical method, which I also have faith in, as you do. I mean, for the natural world, I actually generally go that way. It can detect and thereby seriously study things that the investigator can control. And so it seems to me there's sort of an underlying assumption or principle. If one, let's say, says that ultimately empiricism is sort of the gatekeeper of objectivity, that if one claims that something is objectively the case, that one has to pass through that gauntlet, one has to show some empirical evidence, that it would lead to a conclusion which I think is, I don't know if I would say absurd, but not very promising. And that is, we can never really know something unless we can control it.
Well, I wouldn't say so. So I agree with you that experimentation, especially from the standpoint of science, we attempt to control as best we can. And this is why science is generally viewed as methodological naturalism and not philosophical naturalism, that I can't prove when I mix these two chemicals together that there's not some transcendent being who's fiddling with the chemistry, but we don't get to assume that there is. And the consistency in being able to test and provide results, especially in the hard sciences, is precisely what we're after. But science, so first of all, the reason that I'm fine with advocating for a version of scientism is a specific version that just says science is the best and possibly only objective means that we could use for epistemology. And if there's something that doesn't rise to that level of testing, that maybe we are, as you pointed out, correct in saying we can't know that, or we can't know that currently. We may have a suspicion, we may have a somewhat justified belief, but it doesn't rise to the level of knowledge without that degree of confirmation. And the truth, well, there's a ton to unpack here. To me, the kind of test for this is if I'm talking about, so epistemology is essentially the philosophical study of how do we know what we know. But an epistemology is an individual methodology that one would use to evaluate claims. And one of the key tests for me is based on the available information for any given claim. If we were to wipe out that information entirely and start over from scratch, how likely are we to discover the same results, like cosmology, physics, biology? It would seem that if we wiped out all of humanity's understanding of this, that those same conclusions that we currently have about biology, cosmology, physics would still be reached by other thinking individuals through this process of experimentation. And claims about religions or things that aren't subject to, that aren't testable, aren't falsifiable, I find it unlikely that they would reach the same results. And that would be an interesting experiment to do. That may be the only experiment that you ever could do, is to say, hey, if meditation and self-reflection leads to this particular conclusion, then it should lead there, even without priming the pump or teaching anybody about that particular religion, that someone going off and doing this themselves should reach the same conclusion. That's the best methodology I can come up for things that maybe we can't fit in a beaker.
Very interesting. These are very interesting points. Okay, first of all, I am not an empirical skeptic. I'm not skeptical about the power of the empirical method. And you could say for the natural world, that's what I always choose. If I'm not the kind of person that's into all kinds of mystic cures for diseases, or I'm actually sort of a old-fashioned, what do the scientists say type of guy. So I'm not a skeptic at all about the empirical method, but I would claim that as you presented the case, there's a serious problem of circular reasoning. And so I'm going to lay out what I think would have to be the case for there to be a spiritual science. And so maybe I'll start with that rather than just kind of like toying around with it. I'll just say openly what I really think. And then you can fill me full of lead. So
I don't think we have to go that far. I do have, it's curious, and this is going to be the linchpin, because you and I never met before, as far as I know, or at least I don't recall. This may be the first conversation I've had with someone who has the particular beliefs you have. So I was keenly interested in doing this. But when I hear things like, so first of all, when you say you're not skeptical of the empirical method for the natural world, I'm skeptical of everything. That's a principle of skepticism. It's just that skepticism is not being mired in doubt all the time. It is actually attempting to confirm something and then either confirming it or failing to confirm. Skepticism is not about debunking. And so I'm glad we're both fine with empirical evidence. But when you say you're fine with it for the natural world, I'm curious as to what reason one could have to believe that there is anything other than the natural world. I mean, because It seems if there's something other than the natural world, and there is some method by which someone has gleaned this information, it should be, I mean, perhaps not easy is not the right word, but it should be something that someone could point out. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to get right into that. And I'm going to make a case. We'll see what happens. But see if I can get up on the scoreboard here. But I'm going to make a case for a spiritual science. And, well, actually, rather than, so to speak, make the case, I'm going to explain what I feel has to be present, has to be the case in order for there to be a spiritual science. I mean, the first thing, obviously, there has to be some spiritual stuff that you can actually be scientific about or that you can actually know. So I'm going to just put
Can I interrupt for one second for
Sure.
Just for clarification? When you say there has to be some spiritual stuff, I'm of two minds. One is that you could be saying there actually needs to be a spiritual realm, or what I think is probably where you're going, which I'm okay with, is there needs to be some claim of a spiritual realm to potentially test.
Yeah. I'm saying that I would say I don't think there can be a spiritual science if there's nothing spiritual out there. If, let's say, everything is just material in form or another, then it would be silly to talk about a spiritual science. So I'm saying that I'm not trying to prove there is. I'm just saying that if it were the case that there's a spiritual science, there would have to be a subject matter. There would have to be an object, a knowable object, which is spiritual.
Okay.
Physical.
I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And so, there would have to be, so spiritual objects, and our nature, I mean, in terms of the ontological reality of our existence, what or who we ultimately are, would have to be such that we have the power to apprehend, we have the power to know that you can call a spiritual world, a God, whatever the object is, that we have the power to know it. And there is a reliable method which, in fact, produces knowledge in those who are, so to speak, spiritual scientists. You said something, what was it that if it were true, the easiest, you get a very interesting point you made, that which I haven't heard before, that let's say if somehow all knowledge of material science was lost, and that if somehow there was a renaissance of science, people would come to the same basic conclusion because presumably the laws of nature are the same, and they might come at it from different angles and different sequences, but ultimately there's an objective fact of nature, and serious, intelligent people who are intellectually honest and diligent would discover it. So I agree with that. And here's the circularity in my view. That because you said that something like that should be the case on the spiritual plane, if there is one, and something like that should also be possible. It seems that, well, first of all, I would agree with you on that is a good test, and I think that is the case. But I think the problem is that sort of the direct or indirect insistence that ultimately spiritual claims be verified by material science. And that type of what I call sort of epistemological imperialism, the idea that and what it sounds like to me, I was just thinking about this today, is it's kind of the mere reflection of that famous, I don't want to say infamous, I won't say what I really think, but that statement from the book of John, that the book of John.
I love I'm not going to say what I really think, but here's what I really think. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I think, well, let me just throw this in. I think the problem in the world is fanaticism. And I think it comes in many flavors. I think, like in politics, on the left and right, there are fanatics and there are people who aren't fanatics. And I think there are fanatical theists and fanatical atheists. And then I think there are reasonable people in all these categories. So on the one hand, you have, that no one comes to the Father but by me, which I think is seriously irrational for many reasons. And on the other hand, you have no one comes to objectivity but by the empirical method. And so to me, these are both kind of epistemologically extreme positions. And so let's say if it's the case, actually I claim it is the case. I'm going to reveal the full extent of my delusion here, but I do claim that it's the case that, well, I'm not claiming in the sense that I can prove this to you or I want to convince you of this. That's not at all my intention. I'm just sort of outing myself here. And I do claim that, or I do believe that there is a spiritual reality and that it is knowable and that we have the intrinsic equipment, if we sort of activate it properly, to know that spiritual reality. And I am not logically, it's not reasonable, required to get the epistemic approval of someone who, in fact, has not practiced that spiritual science and is not well informed, is not really qualified. It's just like, referee journals in science. I remember when I took an astronomy class ages ago at UCLA, And we read this little clip. I'm sorry, what did we call it? Little article from the New York Times when Einstein discovered some of his great theories. And a New York Times reporter was interviewing a head of the Royal Astronomy Society. And he said, could you please explain what Einstein did in lay terms? He said, can you explain that for my readers? And the guy said, no, actually, I can't. And of course, since then, there's been a lot of popular versions of it. But I mean, knowledge tends to be like a pyramid. And in the sense that in any field, whether it's math or biology or history, that a lot of people know very basic things and fewer people know the advanced knowledge. And so in the case of metaphysical knowledge or spiritual knowledge, I think it would be irrational to call upon a physicalist to evaluate my claim, because as much as it would be irrational to have me evaluate a claim, let's say in physics, that would be irrational. And I think for the same reason, I mean, the notion of proving entails or requires, I would say, a qualified judge, and to say so again, I don't think I have to pass that gauntlet that, hey, the empiricists approve of my spiritual understanding, so therefore it's objective.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, then you're objecting to this notion that spiritual claims should be verified by empirical science. And that's not the position I was advocating for. So what I'm saying is, so this is the crux of what we're talking about. And that is our differing epistemologies, our differing personal epistemologies. You don't have to prove anything to anybody unless you're actually trying to convince them of that. However, the difference in our view on this is whether or not you could, because so science doesn't make any proclamation of truth. So science being from the Latin scientia for knowledge, scientific methods have continually demonstrated to be the most consistently reliable path to knowledge. And that means that any method, even one that we're not aware of now, which can demonstrate that it consistently produces reliable results, would be included as a part of science. If casting lots or divine revelation or lucky socks or exorcisms or astrology, if any of them could demonstrate the reliability in the results, they would be a part of science. And science, in this process of not making proclamations of truth, is just giving the most reliable methods and reliable informations and presenting a model that best accounts for the observation, and it needs to be testable and falsifiable. And so when you're pointing out that your epistemology doesn't have to be justified, and you have no obligation to justify your epistemology to empiricists, you're correct. But when we're talking about epistemology, to me, we're talking about knowledge. And it seems bizarre to me to suggest that there is such a thing as a subjective epistemology or an esoteric epistemology that is in fact true, because I reject this notion that there's a personal truth. If in fact there is a deity, be it Allah, Krishna, Yeshua, whoever, or a collection of deities, that is in fact a fact of the objective state of affairs, and you could personally believe in that objective state of affairs and you would be correct, but that being correct is independent of whether or not you can demonstrate this. And epistemology is all about the demonstrating. It's not about whether or not you're right. I mean, I could be right that humans are great apes for really, really bad reasons. But if I am going to talk about epistemology and make a sound case that I'm talking about actual knowledge and not personal esoteric views that I'm personally convinced of, then I need to have a testable, falsifiable method. And this isn't saying everything must conform to science qua today's science. If you have any method that can consistently produce results, it becomes a part of science. And somebody has this notion that there is a soul or an afterlife or a transcendent plane or a deity, and they are actually have sound evidential warrant with their methodology, that the reliability of their methodology is something they should be able to demonstrate to anybody.
I agree with you.
Or actually, almost anybody.
Okay, very good. I'm enjoying this very much. So, first of all, I would argue that, well, first of all, I'm against subjectivism. So I'm glad you brought that out, because I think postmodernism, a la Richard Rorty, is, a really, really bad idea, apart from self-contradictory.
I think it decays any hope of ever saying, I don't think we have access to capital T truth. I don't think we can be absolutely certain about anything, but I think we can be reasonably certain within the boundaries of reason. But I think that the thing we're both rejecting, this notion of subjective truths, is a terrible acidic solution that eliminates the entirety of any hope of truth.
Yeah, I was actually amazed as I watched the YouTube thing with Rorty. He said there are no great truths, but of course that would be a great truth. I mean, the fact that there are no great truths is a great. So anyway.
Oh, no. There are no great truths would actually be a black and white truth. It's an assertion that there are no blacks, and it's a binary. But yes, go ahead.
So yeah, so we are. I mean, I think we have, although we have different epistemologies or systems, I think we really share a dedication to reason, and to try to be reasonable, and therefore I, with you, reject some type of subjectivism. Now,
I agree, and I'm hoping that, and I'm going to let you continue just 1 second. I'm genuinely hoping that we maybe get to put competing epistemological models together to see where they lead. But yes, you and I seem to be at least giving lip service, if not actual service, to the notion that reason is the prime foundation for all of this.
Okay, so I would challenge the notion that empiricism has been the most consistently reliable path to knowledge. I would agree with that. I think if we're talking about the path to knowledge of the natural world, I agree, strongly agree with you. And like I said, and it doesn't mean I blindly accept, let's say, the claims of scientists, but if the scientific community seems to reach a consensus and there are observable, reliable applications and everything, then I just go with it. And so I do. Actually, I really love science. I mean real science, not philosophical materialism masquerading as science, but actual science. Actual science, I'm a big fan, and every time I go to a dentist, I'm profoundly grateful to science. So, as far as the challenge you put forward, which is a good one, that if I'm not a subjectivist, how do I claim there's a spiritual science? I would claim that ultimately there is an inevitable sociology of knowledge. There's an inevitable social aspect to knowledge. Thomas Kuhn, of course, talks a lot about this. But if you look at the history of science up till the present, science tends to take place in communities. And there are refereed journals, and scientists have to demonstrate their findings or their claims to other scientists. And there is, I think a lot of it is objective. Some of it, as we know from the study of the history of science, can be subjective. But I think there's enough objectivity to make it an invaluable enterprise. So I'm not in any way questioning the value of science or the validity of good science done properly, where you compensate for, try to avoid some of the historical pitfalls of groupthink and whatever. So I would claim, I have to claim, in order to at least put forward a model of a spiritual science, that you get something very much like that within a spiritual community. And so that you have, let's say, a philosophy or a theory, you have a practice, people are satisfied that they are able to confirm the theory through the practice, and that this takes place among a very large number of people. Historically, we can talk about many, many hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. And you find this extraordinary stability in the sense that people are not, like every generation or a few generations, changing the theory. And so, and now going to my own experience, my first person experience, I would say that all the elements are there that you require. It may not be accessible to everyone, but for those who take it seriously, we have an idea, philosophy, we have a practice, we have a remarkable and measurable change of consciousness, self-evident experiences. I know you want to get in on that thing, the idea of a self-evident experience. But I have had, let's say, consistently throughout my spiritual practice, which is like 51 years now, experiences which for me in every way are properly basic, and they're not subjective in the sense that what I'm experiencing, I read books and I find for thousands of years people have been having identical experiences because I do believe that despite cultural differences, there are universals and human beings can communicate over space and time. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you're not
people
want to say something.
People are asking for a definition of spiritual.
Okay. By spiritual, I mean, okay, let me put it this way. Reality, according to this view, is, you could say, bidimensional, or there are, the way Krishna explains it in the Gita is that there are fundamentally two kinds of energy. And there is one energy which you can call matter, prakriti, and then there is a spiritual energy, which is actually the soul. We are the spiritual energy, and ultimately, of course, there's a God. So this is not Cartesian dualism, I should point out. And by the way, Descartes making a comeback, because I always thought that he was rejected with a bunch of cheap shots. But anyway, that was my opinion. But there is a resurgence among some philosophers of interest in substance dualism. But the ontology that I'm presenting is not simple dualism. It's not that these are, because the argument was always that, okay, if there's spirit and matter, how do they interact? Because they're in different dimensions, et cetera, et cetera. So the view that I have learned, and I think is true, is that say different kinds of energy, let's say matter and spirit, are different, but also one. They are not, it's not a strict dualism. It's what you could call one and different. And by the way, the notion that this ontological position of one and different simultaneously has a long history, even in Western philosophy. The idea that, I mean, to give one simple example, I mean, the Greeks actually got at this in a very different way in their debates over the relationship between categories and members of categories, but that's a whole different discussion. But for example, take the category thing. We're all human beings, but at the same time, we're unique individuals. In order to do this program, we're actually performing two cognitive tasks. One is that we can identify different things, like, for example, different words and the meanings of words and syntax and semantics. And, there's a microphone, there's a computer screen, there's different parts of my body, there's millions of different individual things, and yet we put it all together into one experience where it's just the experience of being here now. And so I would say in healthy relationships, there's two individuals, but they're one. It's one couple, but if they really merge, it's like codependence. If they're two separate, it's not a good relationship. So I would argue that almost everywhere you look ontologically in this world, you can find oneness and you can find difference. And that something like that is the ontology, is the relationship between spirit and matter. And I would say consciousness is ultimately spiritual, but it becomes conditioned by, it is conducted by, and is in many ways affected by neurology at the present time during our presence in this world. But the very fact that I would say consciousness as a spiritual object obviously interacts with matter because they're not simply different. It's not a strong dualism.
Yeah, so I don't know that we got any, and this, I'm not faulting you because I get what you're saying. I don't think we got any closer to a definition of what spiritual is. And a lot of that just seemed like, to me, a metaphor and different ways to describe stuff. Oh, there's two people, but they're one, and things like that. And oh, there's matter, and then there's spirit. But I took notes on several of the things that you said before that question came in that I wanted to hit. This issue where you're not convinced that empiricism is necessarily the most consistently reliable method, and yet
for things, I'm sorry, I do accept it as the most consistently reliable method for studying
of the natural world, but not of the other world, that you believe but can't demonstrate.
But again, you're begging the question.
I'm not begging the question. Yeah. I'm getting to that point.
Okay, but if I can say one thing, because if I don't correct this, okay. I mean, it sounds pretentious, but if I don't make this point, then we're going to go around in circles.
Okay.
And that is when you say demonstrate, my experience in life is that I have demonstrated the truth of this spiritual thing that I'm doing to many, many thousands of people who are happy and satisfied that it has been demonstrated to them that they are epistemically justified in every way and that they have properly basic experiences of spiritual things. As far as and so to say I haven't demonstrated is just to, again, switch it back into the empirical arena, and that's what I'm not accepting.
No, it's not about me switching it back to the empirical arena, and I'm going to explain why I don't think you've actually demonstrated this and why nobody else has and why this isn't considered a science, because it can't be. So first of all, there's no consistency in the results. The test methodology is necessarily biased. If someone is being educated about what they're supposed to experience in certain ways, that biases the results. In the same way that the general notion from people and description of alien abductions fundamentally changed after Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We went from a variety of different alien experiences down to primarily little gray aliens with almond eyes because of that influence and how it changed what was in there. The difference, you talked about science as if it were a communal exercise, and to some extent that's true. The part that you overlooked is that science is also a competitive exercise, and that in order for science to evaluate something, it needs to be testable and it needs to be falsifiable. And the methods of science are such that we do everything in our power to eliminate bias. And the type of thing that you're doing when you're trying to show the spiritual realm that you are convinced is real and that you think other people experience, I can't say this because you haven't given me the test methodology, but everything you've described about that test methodology is necessarily biased. There's no attempt to remove the bias from it. I'm not saying you have to present empirical evidence for your claim. I'm not taking your claim and saying, oh, it must fit within this mold. I'm saying the mold that we use to determine whether or not something's true is whether or not it can, without biased guidance, result in consistent results. And for things like spiritual feelings, I don't see how that's even possible. But when the experiences are, when you have different people who have identical experiences, absent any priming, there's no priming of the pump involved. And this is the example that I came up with earlier. If we took a bunch of 5-year-olds who had never learned anything about bhakti-yoga or Christianity or Hinduism or Islam and put them on an island and let them grow up, they would still learn the same things about which foods to eat and which foods not to eat. But I see no evidence that any of them would come up with anything that is consistent with any of the religious and supernatural claims. And that's an experiment that fortunately and unfortunately we can't do, because it would be cruel to dump a bunch of 5-year-olds on an island. But it's the sort of experiment that should be done. And the evidence is already against that, because there is no consistency of revelation. There is no consistency of experiment. There is no consistency of identity within, we've all had these spiritual experiences and they lead to thousands upon thousands of little switches and differences in religion. There isn't consistency. The one consistent feature is that we are always talking about a human psyche experiencing something after being told what they should potentially experience.
Okay, I would like to answer all those points because I think there are very good answers to all those points.
Cool.
First of all, regarding, and I hope I get this right, regarding consistency, I will again say that we have thousands of years of consistency. Regarding the idea, let's say there are many religions, that's a very typical argument. And I would say among religious fanatics or among non-philosophical religionists who make unique historical claims like the prophet appeared here, the Son of God came there, or God came from their place. If you look in the philosophy of religion, if you look among the philosophers, not the true believers, because there's all kinds of, like phony so-called science, like people, cures for diseases and stuff like that. But if you look at serious scientists who are trained, who are educated, there's more uniformity. If you look at serious philosophers of religion, they disagree on some points, but there's remarkable consistency on many points. That's inter-religious. If you look within a tradition, like I said, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people having remarkable consistency and coming to the same conclusion. So the idea that there's no consistency, I think, is just sort of a caricature of actual religious history. Another thing is that you made the point that in science, or let's say in religion, people are primed. I think you said priming the pump, what they should expect. First of all, if you get a science education, you are primed for about 10 or 15 years. And I know many stories about, what happens to people who dare challenge a certain scientific orthodoxy. And Thomas Kuhn talks about that. I'm not trying to discredit science. I'm just trying to say humans are humans. They may be spiritual seekers, they may be scientists, but there's all kinds of human foibles that appear in lots of places. Another thing, I think you've sort of given a caricature of the process by which people come to embrace, at least in some cases. There are born fanatics in every field, science and also spirituality. But especially in my personal experience, because my experience is embracing what I still call a spiritual science, which I was not born with. I had no family pressure to do so. There wasn't the usual thing like, okay, you want to make your parents happy, or you just want to be accepted in your community. There was all the sociological pressure was against me. And therefore, I subjected that process to just a somewhat rigorous examination. In my experience, at least, there are true believers in every field, but the people I've worked with and in my own life, I think there was a healthy amount of skepticism. There was rigor. I've challenged assumptions that I've been taught. I have gotten myself in a lot of trouble because I have rejected a lot of things that I was told I was supposed to believe, but I found irrational. And so people don't all switch their brains off when they accept a spiritual path. And so I think I was appropriately rigorous and critical and comparative and everything else. So just to cover, I'm sorry, do you want to, because I had a few other points that you mentioned, but do you want to jump in?
Well, there's a couple quick things because, so first of all, one thing about science is that falsifiability is a key thing. And science, as I was pointing out, isn't just a cooperative, it's a competitive exercise. And so if someone could demonstrate the truth of any particular religion, and they had a methodology that was reliable, it would be accepted as science and it would overturn the foundations of science. The difference between a scientist and an advocate for a particular religion is that scientists can demonstrate an actual expertise by appealing to the facts.
But you're just repeating the same fallacy. We're just trapped in the same circularity. In other words, because you can't. In other words, you're making arguments for the superior.
I'm sorry that you don't have facts. I did not say that they had to be consistent with known empirical facts. It is, as I've said several times, if there was an epistemology, if there was a sound methodology that led to the truth of Hinduism, Christianity, whatever, it would become a science. It's not the fault of science. Science's view here is to try to eliminate as much bias as possible and to have the best methods producing the best results.
I would challenge that because I don't think it would, because science, there's this huge multi-trillion-dollar, super entrenched university domination.
This is conspiracy theorist nonsense. If somebody could prove if somebody could reasonably prove that a version of Hinduism were true, they would get the Nobel Prize. They would get funding from anyone and everyone.
Matt, you said conspiracy nonsense. I didn't even finish the sentence.
You didn't need to. I've heard it 1,000 times. You are suggesting you are suggesting that there's so much money in science that they're not willing to accept anything new, when science is demonstrably about discovering the new things and attempting to prove them false.
Actually, that's not what I was going to say.
Okay.
So I know you've been in a lot of debates, and you've probably heard a lot of these preludes, but no, that's actually I'm not going to say. I wasn't going to say that.
Well, you're not going to say it now. Here's the crux. How do I tell if your particular view on religion or the supernatural or spiritual, however you want to find it, how can I tell whether or not your view is correct, or whether Johnny the Christian down the street from me is correct, or whether neither of you are correct?
Okay, Johnny the Christian. Yeah, I just converted Johnny this morning. So, no, first of all, I think your question entails some misunderstandings about or about what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Because I think both of us grew up in a society, say Western society, in which you have what I call tribal monotheism as opposed to philosophical monotheism.
My question has nothing to do with how I grew up or anything else. The question is, how do I tell the difference between two competing religious claims?
No, it actually does. And I can show
it doesn't. No, you're accusing me of having a question biased by my upbringing. I'm asking, how do I tell which of two competing claims is true? This is the whole reason to have a discussion about epistemology, because the purpose of epistemology is to tell the difference between two competing claims.
If you allow me, I'll show you the bias. The biases are very obvious. And that is, in the world we grew up in, there's the idea that there's one true religion, and if this religion is true, other religions are not true. So you said, which one? That precludes the possibility, which I think is the real case, that in many religions, there's a significant amount of truth.
Johnny's religion says that your religion is not true. They are necessarily in conflict. Even if you don't think they are, Johnny's version is. That's why I included two. How do I tell which of you is correct?
However, you see, what you're doing is, consistently here, you're taking the best version of science and the worst version of religion. I've already stated, I'm saying things, but somehow they're not registering with you.
The worst version of science is better than the best version of religion, but I asked how to tell the difference. How does your epistemology get to your...
Go ahead. That's like schoolyard calling names. That's not philosophy.
It's a fact. Because it is a fact, because the worst parts of science are still based on demonstrating the difference and a propensity, a likelihood of something being true. And yet when I ask you, you're just not allowing me to reply to what you're saying.
I'm
pretty sure that I am going to allow you to reply. I'm pretty sure that you've spoken considerably more than I have. I had a question, which is, if you claim that your particular version of religion is true.
I was trying to answer.
I didn't even get to the end of the question. Go ahead.
What I was trying to say is that it is a false assumption that for one religion to be true, others have to be untrue.
I'm not making that assumption. I'm saying that one of the two religions is saying that.
However, my experience is that some of the people in these religions say that, and there are philosophers and theologians in these religions that, in fact, don't say that. And so
that's not a problem, because I didn't ask about those. I asked, if I'm presented with your case for your religion and a case for a religion that says your religion is wrong, what methodology could I use to determine that you are correct?
Okay, but first of all, what you said was, it's like me saying to you, since you wanted to, I'll tell you the worst version of science. The worst version of science is maybe, young earthism. Maybe
that's not science.
However, if you have the prerogative to exclude out things that are not really science, in other words, just from a purely sociological, socio-historical perspective, regarding certain scientific issues, There are many, many voices. However, there are ways in which you and others try to filter that, and you identify, okay, what's really science here? Now, in the field of religion, and not only that, if you look at science, for many, many, many centuries, it was kind of a mess. I mean,
I'm still waiting for your epistemological foundation to show that you're correct.
However, you threw a lot of stuff out there that I want to clean up. The fact is, if you look at the history of science, what we find is that for up until fairly recently, it was mixed with magic and superstition and
yes.
And so the kind of pristine science.
How is that relevant? Because the only thing that has ever corrected science is more science, not religion.
So I'll tell you how it's relevant. It's relevant because the fact that you, as an outsider to religion, let's say, you're obviously looking at it from outside, you see a mess, does not, and it is a mess, does not mean that within that mess, it is impossible to discern something like spiritual science. And so the fact that it's externally a mess, or the fact that Johnny down the street says that I'm going to hell or something, is not, in other words, plurality does not prove relativity. And so if we really want to talk about it, and so to get to your key question, which I want to address, and that is, if I get to my other points, I think...
Perhaps it's useful to look at the epistemology for the conflicting viewpoints. On what basis are these other religions saying we're right and everyone else is wrong? Do they have an epistemology behind that which stands up compared to our epistemology?
I think that reason, believe it or not, I believe that certain theological claims are irrational on their face. Whether they're true, for example, saying that God is all merciful, but he tortures his own children forever for somewhat minor theological mistakes, I think is grossly contradictory. It's irrational. It doesn't pass the test of coherentism.
And you can add to that this exclusivist idea too, right? Like, if I say my God is all loving and only people who are a member of my church are saved and everyone else is going to hell, those two ideas are incoherent.
Well, the problem with saying I have the only path, which I think is very irrational, is that if you don't tie claims of spirituality to any type of behavioral modification, and this obviously will not satisfy Matt, but I think it's kind of flirting with some of
it shouldn't satisfy you because you rejected this notion of subjective truths to begin with. I'd still love an answer to my question, since we're supposed to be talking about epistemology. You have an epistemology that has led you to a conclusion. How can I, as an outsider, discern whether or not you are correct? That is the whole point of epistemology. That's the question I've asked.
Okay, and my answer would be you can't, just as I, as an outsider to science, can't evaluate scientific claims.
That's absolutely untrue. You can evaluate scientific claims as long as you are willing to learn and apply the methodology to examine it.
Okay, but this is semantic because
it's not semantic. And by the way, semantic is about how words are used and what they mean, which is about the most important thing one could do in a conversation. Otherwise, we're talking past each other.
I'll tell you why I said what I said and why it's true. Because when I said outsider, what I meant by that was someone who has not actually gone into science, studied it, and done the very hard work. Because let's say if I want to get to the point where I can really rationally evaluate advanced scientific claims, I have to invest years and years of my life.
Correct. Dr. Resnick, when I ask a scientist, how can I know that you're right? And their explanation is to study the science and do the investigations. That is them supporting their epistemology to show how they came to the right answer. You have failed to do anything remotely like that, and you have deflected and poo-pooed science since I first asked this question.
First of all, I have not poo-pooed science. Secondly, I did explain it, but somehow it just keeps going past you. So I'll try to break it down and make it more clear how I did answer the question, actually a number of times. And that is, and I'll add something new just for your amusement here. And that is, I claim there is a spiritual science. I claim that any person who adopts appropriate study and so on can experience these things. Now, there is a fundamental difference in the way we understand dead things and the way we understand living things. I'll try to connect the dots. I mean, maybe I should have tied it together better for you, but it's all there. It's all been laid out for you. And that is, if you're trying to understand a dead thing that you can, in principle, control, whether it's a galaxy or a cell or whatever it is, in principle, it's dead matter, if we're allowed still to say that, and you can control and study it if you have lab conditions. And let's say faraway galaxies, like where Star Wars took place, we don't have the technology now to get up close to those things, but in principle, science can one day take us there. So in principle, we can study these things. When we're studying living things, persons, we can't drag them into laboratories in the same way. We can't control them in the same way. Living beings have free will. Now, I want to get into the point of experiment design. When you design experiments, you have to believe that you either know or suspect something about the thing you're studying. You design an experiment which is appropriate for what you think you're looking for. Or something.
I mean, I don't want to be rude, but considering you still haven't answered my question and you haven't demonstrated an understanding of science, why are you lecturing us on how to design a test? Because what I'm asking you is, what test could we design to show that you're right?
I'm actually explaining that. And you are, with all due respect, Matt, there's a whole bunch of good stuff that is just going right by you and you're not catching it.
Okay, so thanks. It's my fault because I'm stupid. Please continue.
I didn't say it's your stupid, but I do, just to be honest with you, I do think it's your fault.
Okay, well, when we put this up online, let's see how many people in the world and how many people with an expertise in science think you or philosophy think you came remotely close to answering my question about how can we determine whether or not your epistemology results in you being viewed as correct.
Okay, and well, I'll try once again.
Chance to explain it, and yeah, go.
Give him a chance. He's been talking for almost 10 minutes since I asked this question, hasn't added one thing about how we could tell that he's correct.
The thing is, when you're making a point which is different from a commonly held view, it takes more explaining. You got to build up more things, and it's easier to criticize
it's also
something
true when you're
than
deflecting and trying to avoid answering the question. I don't need a lecture from you to how to answer your questions either.
And Matt, this is not the best side of you kind of insulting like this. I mean,
I'm not insulting. I have asked a very straightforward question that is about the subject here.
Because it's very
I am allowing you to explain. You're going on and have not once described how we basically you did answer the question once, and you said that we can't know that you're correct.
No, I said you can't. No, Matt, you're just not getting it. I said you can't know it's correct if you don't take the time to study and go through the process. That's what I said many times. So what I'm saying is, the reason I'm going through experiment design is because you are immersed in science.
Yes.
And in fact, science has not developed advanced methodologies to look for, whether they're there or not, things that they can't control and things which are personal and not mechanical or just dead and physical. Science
doesn't make it as science doesn't have to. So the fact whether something's dead or alive doesn't impact whether or not it can be examined by science.
It does. It
doesn't. So dead things and living things can be examined by science.
If the living things are superior to us and not subject to our control, then it very much is a factor.
Science can't investigate living things? Is that what you're saying?
It can, however, not by a methodology which requires you to control something is not appropriate if you're studying something far beyond your control. Simple point.
The fact that there's a different method required when scientists, I don't know, let's say, point a spectrometer at a star in order to figure out what it's made of, and examine a human being in order to figure out what it's made of or what its origin. The fact that there's different methods, is about what that thing is made of and what the limits are. But that doesn't mean that science can't look into this. So
however,
how is it the same? Oh, go ahead.
In both those cases you gave, we're talking about studying things that, at least methodologically, science has some control. They have some type of controlled access. They can study it. They know, let's say, the particular galaxy or star is going to be in a certain location, and they can look at it, and they can measure, you know, the light that's coming off it, and so on. So if you're trying to study something that you have absolutely no control over, you can't do things like that. So
can I ask this? Maybe this will be clear.
Yeah.
Please tell me how science can tell the difference between something that it can't investigate and something that does not exist.
Okay. It can't. However, science can investigate spiritual things, but it requires a very different methodology. And that's why when I say, because I like what you said, that science is open to anything which can be shown to be knowledge or factual. I think that's very positive.
I apologize. This is not a thing. Can the moderator just block and ban the person called Chomsky Videos who's spamming in chat? He's an annoying troll who's been following me around for years, and he's just spamming moderator. And I want him to know that I think he's being an obviously objectionable jackass who needs to go away.
Oh, he's gone. Yeah. Glad to do it for you. Yeah, glad to do it. So, if someone is locked into a philosophy of science where you have to control, and again, I'm not challenging empirical science, but if let's say you're trying to look for God, just to put it in, or look for a soul, it's not the kind of thing you can perform an empirical experiment on. It doesn't get other ways.
How can you find it?
Okay, I would say that, I mean, what we teach is through devotion.
But how can you find it? Because you're talking about a subjective experience. I'm asking for how can I find the truth of what you're saying?
Yeah, here's the problem, because when you do empirical science.
I didn't say empirical science. I'm asking you, I don't care if you say, Matt, go and pray, Matt, go and meditate. I'm asking, what do I have to do to discover what you've discovered?
Yeah, you would have to practice bhakti-yoga earnestly, which involves a regulated practice of meditation and devotion, and that's the process.
And if somebody did that and did not come to the same conclusions that you did, which of you is right?
I would say that if someone does that, and some people do that and don't come to the same conclusion, just as in science, there are some differences of opinion on different issues. If someone did that, we would say that they're not there yet. Because, you see, again, we're talking about a very large, consistent community coming down over long time spans, agreeing very precisely in very small details about what they're doing, what they're experiencing, what has been proved to them, what the spiritual science is. So some people think that start a science career and then decide it's all a conspiracy or it's this or that. I mean, in every field, some people drop out.
Yeah. So we're finally at the point where you've answered the question that I asked, because all I asked was, what do I have to do, whatever it is, to demonstrate this? And then the follow-up question was, if somebody does that and does not come to the same conclusion, your answer is they're just not there yet. How is that not an answer that would apply equally to the truth of your proposition and to the falseness of your proposition?
Because
I mean, that's circular. You're assuming that there's a there for them to reach, which means you're assuming you're already correct. And the people who don't agree with you just aren't there yet. Incredibly insulting, and it's poisoning the well.
No, it's not any more than you are insulting and poisoning when you say that someone tries to understand, let's say, quantum mechanics and decides, it's all nonsense, that you're poisoning the well by saying they just didn't get it. You see,
no, if somebody doesn't understand quantum mechanics, it's fair to say they just didn't get it. But that doesn't change whether or not quantum mechanics is demonstrable. And actually, I'm not an advocate for that.
But there's a circularity. If it's a fact, which I would claim it is, that there is an objective spiritual truth, that there are very large numbers of people who are experiencing it, even if they're not in my tradition,
Sure.
Because I see a lot of people having valid realizations in many other traditions. If that's true, then you see what you're not showing is that we don't have a parallelism. You keep assuming that, for example, if someone tries bhakti-yoga and doesn't make it, then necessarily that invalidates, a billion people that did it. Whereas if you have a large scientific community that has...
No, I apologize, but that's not at all what I've done. I'm not saying that if someone failing to reach the same conclusion to you proves that you're wrong. That would be the fallacy. I'm saying that until you can demonstrate that you're right, no one is justified in believing you're right. I'm not saying you're wrong at all. I've never said that. I described this at the beginning in detail when I was talking about the limits of skepticism. You could, in fact, be entirely correct and never be able to demonstrate it to anybody else. You being correct is independent from whether or not you are warranted, and it's also independent from whether or not somebody else is warranted. But if we're having a debate and a discussion about competing epistemologies, you simply pointing out, well, my epistemology, it may not always work for everybody. It may not actually get us to this thing where you could ever know. Then what you're doing is acknowledging that your epistemology is not useful for reaching the truth in any demonstrable way.
Not at all, because there's no epistemology on earth, including empiricism, that works for everybody. This country is, how should I put, filled with science deniers, science doubters. In fact, in the postmodern madness we live in, there's almost a crisis of skepticism about science.
So first of all, it's not skepticism, but the people who don't agree with the science have no impact on whether or not the methodology of science is reliable. And you should know that because you accept science.
I would say that my methodology, yeah, I do. And the methodology I'm talking about is equally reliable. You see, what you're assuming without any...
How can you say equally reliable?
I'll explain that.
Okay.
I was about to complete that sentence. That in the case where, let's say someone tries to do bhakti yoga and just says, well, it's not working for me. You take that one case as somehow invalidating billions of other cases.
No, I don't. And I just explained that literally 15 seconds ago. And if you'd have listened, you'd know that. How dare you accuse me of doing the thing I just explained I didn't do?
Well, I'm sorry, but I really have to go back and listen, but it really sounds...
I have not invalidated anybody else's experience. I have not said that they are wrong. I literally just explained this to you.
What did you say? Please say it again.
I said that I am not concluding that anyone is wrong merely because someone else is unable to do that. That would be the fallacy. I am saying I just literally said you may in fact be right and never be able to demonstrate it.
Okay, that was the point then. Sorry. That's the point I wanted to talk about. I've been able to demonstrate it to very large numbers, and I'm just one person. It's not about me. It's been demonstrated to billions of people. And so to say that it can't be demonstrated is unintelligible when I explained to you the history.
Hello, I think I lost audio.
Oh, I can hear you.
Nope, I can hear you.
Yeah. So, historically, it's just like every scientist in the Western world accepted Ptolemy. It turns out he was wrong, but he had a lot of good math. But when you have a tradition, also there's an underlying assumption, I think, in your argument, which I would like to address explicitly, and that is that somehow, if there is a science, a real science, that it somehow must be publicly available to and acceptable by everyone. And
so whether or not people accept science is independent from whether or not science is demonstrably reasonable. If I take hydrogen and oxygen and combine them, I get water, period. And anybody who follows the exact same steps will always do it. If I mix this amount of this mixture with this amount of this mixture, everybody who does that and follows the steps will get to the same result. That is the consistency and uniformity of that particular thing.
True. However, there is,
and that's why what you're advocating qualify.
Yeah. However, but you've taken a very, very, very basic point. When we get to higher stages of science, then you get more disagreement. Sometimes you get more skepticism from people who don't really understand the science. And so, and in fact, some of the more advanced claims of science, or even middle level, are not as simple as just take some hydrogen.
All right. So entry-level science, mid-level science, high-level science doesn't matter. The process of science is here's what I did, and here are the results, and then we pass it off to others to attempt to replicate and verify those results.
Yes.
And if those results are not replicated and verified, we don't then say, well, those people just aren't there yet on their science.
Okay, okay. You've kind of demonstrated what I believe is your underlying assumption, which I'll state again, okay. And that is that if spiritual claims are valid, then it has to exactly to science in the sense that anyone can just simply do it, because when you take oxygen and you take, what was the other one?
Hydrogen?
Hydrogen, right? H2O, right. You can see I'm a great scientist. When you take hydrogen and oxygen, you mix them. What's interesting is it's a physical, mechanical act which requires nothing in terms of, oh, that's right, you made one statement. That's right, you talked about spiritual feelings as if it was just feelings. It's not feelings. There's all kinds of very, very serious philosophy involved. But in any case,
that's easy to say. I'd love to see it, because if you're describing an experience that somebody has, now we're necessarily talking about something that's subjective.
Yeah. However, you're kind of requiring. You said I think you're back in the same circularity.
No, it's not circular. We agreed at the beginning that truth is not subjective. So how can you be appealing to some subjective truth?
I think I'll explain what I meant, because I think I didn't. Okay, it's this. That it is the nature of physical science that, as you correctly said, that at least certain, certainly the basic aspects of it, and even other things, are available to public scrutiny. So if I mix hydrogen and oxygen, it absolutely doesn't matter what my attitude is toward hydrogen and oxygen.
Correct.
Yes. The efficacy of that process is completely independent of my attitudes, my emotions, everything. It just works.
Which, by the way, before we start getting emails, I'm not suggesting you can just pour hydrogen and oxygen. There's a process. I was talking about the makeup of water, not the actual test.
Okay, fine. So, however, the process of knowing spiritual reality is not merely mechanical, or it actually requires a giving of the self, and
I don't know what that means.
Okay, it's like, let's say you fall in love with someone, and it could be a child, it could be a partner, it could be whatever.
I got a partner I'm in love with. I don't know what giving of the self means, and it does. Yes. Okay.
Every relation may not be that way, but it is a desire to do everything in one's power to help or to please the person you love, because you think the person is worthy of that.
Sure. Okay. So if you mean by giving of the self, evidently, in order to be spiritual, or in order to have this spiritual experience, I must desire to do. But that is exactly the same as a self-reinforcing delusion. That is the priming of the pump that I'm talking about, where if you tell someone, hey, you really need to want this to experience it.
Well, that's true in relationships. If you're in a relationship with someone, and the person says, I don't think you really want.
I can love somebody completely, whether they even know about it or not.
True. That's very true. However, to sustain a relationship, but even the fact of, for example, if you love someone, then it's to be presumed that you know that person, or you know something about that person. It's not just an irrational infatuation, but actually you know enough about that person to...
How do you tell the difference?
How do you tell the difference?
How do you tell the difference between somebody who has an irrational infatuation and love?
Oh, that's easy. Read Jane Austen.
Okay. I'm asking real questions about epistemology, and you're pointing me to poetry.
Okay, no. Well, I think there's a lot of wisdom in her book. Okay, I'll answer your question. Ultimately, it's about character. I think that serious love has something to do with really deeply respecting and admiring someone's character, who they are as a person, as opposed to finding their body exciting, which, as we know, doesn't always last that long. So I think it's about character. It's about understanding who someone is, and there's a deep admiration, a deep affection, a deep attraction to another person.
See, I think the difference here is that I'm going to assume that you and I have both experienced what it's like to be in love with somebody. I have. I'm assuming you have. Right?
Yeah.
Is that the correct assumption? Sure.
Yeah.
The difference here is that I'm willing to accept that both of us have had this experience of being in love with someone. And so we have some commonality in this experience, and we can describe it. The problem is that you're adding to the description something that I don't recognize, and then claiming that this is a truth that I'm just not ready for, and that you have no way of demonstrating this. And yet the whole conversation was supposed to be about epistemology, and yet you seem to just be admitting that you don't have the ability to demonstrate this, which is the purpose of epistemology.
No.
So how do I tell the difference between somebody saying love is something that a God imbues us with versus love is a part of our psychology? Now, I'm not saying you hold either one of those, but let's say that two people made those claims. How do I tell the difference between them?
Okay, first of all, what you just said, I've actually explained it many times, and I'll say it one more time, the first question you asked. And that is, as you know, some people apply for, let's say, programs in science and aren't admitted. So if I say that first of all, I would say you as a person certainly have the ability to discover or understand a spiritual science. It's not that you can't do that. I am convinced, as from what I know of you, that it's not something you really are interested in. So,
wow.
How should I put it? Not in the sense, don't take it the wrong way. I don't mean not interested in the sense, I do think that you are sincerely interested in anything which is objectively true, and you're not ruling things out a priori, and you are sincere.
Well, if you're convinced that I'm interested in anything that's objectively true, and you're convinced that I'm not interested in what you're selling, then what you're selling clearly is not objectively true.
No.
QED.
No, absolutely not. That's bad logic. Because it's
no, sir. If you say that you don't think I'm actually interested in it, and you admit that I'm interested in things that are objectively true, that's a set theory. Here's things that are objectively true I'm interested in. Here's your thing, not part of that set. It's not a lie.
That real bad logic. I'll explain why.
No, sir. It's not bad logic. It is. Okay, go ahead.
It is possible, it happens every day, that someone can generally be interested in knowledge and sincerely interested in knowledge, and however, not be interested in certain methods of acquiring knowledge because they don't have the intuition. Let's say a certain amount of intuition, or to make that an interesting option. William James talks about this. He talks about what he calls our live options. So for you, finding a spiritual science is not a live option. So the fact that someone honestly wants to find truth doesn't mean that person in every way is prepared to do the right things. It may be that they're just not in that frame of mind.
Like somebody could be interested in improving their health, but they're not interested in changing their diet.
Or they're not interested in I have people I've worked with who died unnecessarily because they made a religion out of, natural medicine, and they had treatable diseases. So people, I'm not saying that you are irrational or, driven by emotions, but I think that people do have predispositions. And if someone is, and I think you have somewhat of a predisposition, which precludes you from really taking seriously the notion of exploring this method of getting knowledge.
Yeah, I no longer care what you think of who I am or what I care about, because you phrased it sloppily enough that it was in fact a fallacy. And if we submitted it to 1,000 logic professors, 1,000 of them would identify as a fallacy. And the fact that you decided to turn it around and massage it in order to get to a slightly different explanation doesn't change the fact that it was a fallacy. But stop analyzing my psyche and have a discussion about actual epistemology.
Where was the fallacy?
The fallacy was you claimed that I cared about objective truth and that I did not claim about I did not care about your position. If your position is in fact objectively true, then it is included in that set.
No.
I explained this.
Not necessarily. No. Not necessarily, because you see, first of all, what I said is not a fallacy. Because it wasn't an argument.
My God, how dishonest can you be? Here's a circle, a Venn diagram. It contains all the things that are objectively true. Your statement was that I cared about objective truth. You also claimed that I did not care about your idea, which means your idea must not, by definition, be included in the circle of things that are objectively true.
See, because you only partially presented what I said, and the part.
No, sir. If you, I was addressing what you said the first time, not what you massaged. I think
after. I was trying.
We should probably move along.
But I think that the assumption.
Yeah, because anybody watching this will be able to rewind and listen to what you actually said and see that I was correct.
I think there's an assumption in your accusation of a logical fallacy, which is that you know where objective truth can be found.
No, sir. Neither one of you understand logic. If you say X cares about objective logic and X does not care about Y, then you are by definition saying Y is not within the circle of objective logic.
Okay,
this is basically this is basic set theory.
I'll tell you what you left out, and I don't think, although I'm making statements, I don't think I'm quite as insulting as you. But the point, here's the point you left out. I don't think we have to resort to that kind of language, like you know nothing about. Here's the point you left out.
You got it wrong. I'm sorry.
Here's the point you left out, Matt. The point you left. I said that, or I tried to explain as politely as I could, that someone can be sincerely interested in knowledge wherever it lies. At the same time, they may not be perfectly neutral. They may not be perfectly objective. And they may have, in other words, it's not impossible that the same person at the same time, on the one hand, does have a sincere desire to get knowledge, but that desire is not completely pure or free of certain predispositions.
Okay, so we'll clip this new description of what you said and put it up against what you actually said the first time when I was right that it was a fallacy.
No, anyway, let's move along. I'm repeating
I think one useful question might be, like with science, scientists can do high-level science, and we have no idea what they're doing, but, they go and make an atom bomb. It's like, well, they must know something because they made an atom bomb. Is there something analogous to the spiritual science where we can see this person's advanced spiritually because of some symptom, which we don't find in the people that have a differing idea, which aren't spiritually advanced?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yes, I would say that if someone is truly spiritually advanced, they should develop saintly character as a symptom of a transformation, a purification of consciousness. They should sort of, you could say it's a behavioral definition. And of course, behavioral definitions are limited. And I know you could say, well, there's other people that don't believe what you believe, and they also. But again, I think there is a certain manifestation of saintly behavior, saintly character, which I think you could show is associated with a certain level of spiritual attainment, and not merely in the community I'm in. But again, if you ask a question, what percentage of people, let's say in America, what percentage of people can verify for themselves, not take on someone else's word, but verify for themselves that, let's say, Einstein was right. They've actually gone through all the equations or quantum mechanics. What percentage of people personally verify that?
100% who take the steps to study it.
But that's not my question. How many people who accept it? And I would say that, but again, you see, you objected when, but if there are people who have taken science courses and ended up as science deniers. That doesn't invalidate science. In the same way, people who sincerely take to, let's say, a spiritual science do get results. The fact that someone is not satisfied, that by itself is not proof that the process doesn't work any more than a science denier who actually took some science courses is proof that science is not valid.
Yeah, and for the fourth time now, that's not what I said. I'm asking someone to prove they're right. I'm not claiming that they're wrong. And you talked about saintly character. Please define what could be viewed as objectively saintly.
Okay. Be kind and compassionate to all creatures.
I wouldn't. Therefore, it's not objective, right? What is kindness? How do you tell what's kindness? Is it kind? I mean, I think we both agree that, let's say, not running over something or not intentionally running over something is kind. But what level of kindness counts as saintly? Does it mean that if there's a cricket on my back porch, that I'm only a saint if I bring the cricket in and give it a new home and feed it and take care of it? Or am I saintly enough just not to squash it? I mean, how do we tell objectively which of those is saintly?
Yeah, I would say that not squashing it is good. Mm-hmm. And if you give it a home, yeah, that's also good. So
Me too, but which one is saintly, and where does saintly come in, and how can we objectively define saintly?
It's not that it's an absolute only way you can behave in a certain. It's a general disposition of a person that consistently, to the best of their knowledge, acts in a way that's for the welfare of other living creatures.
But isn't that a subjective thing?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It's.
I mean, if I think I'm living the best life I can subjectively, you think you're living the best life that you can subjectively, and there is an objective right answer, then what's the method? What is the epistemology that we can use to figure out which one of us is correct about our subjective assessment?
Okay, based on my assumptions.
That's subjective?
Not necessarily.
Necessarily. The second you start a sentence with based on my assumptions.
No. For example, you assume that if you mix hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. You assume that's true.
I'm not assuming anything. I learned that. I didn't assume that mixing that is true. I learned that as a finding of science. But the second you start with based on my assumptions, you are necessarily saying that that this is your position and it is subjective.
No. The word assumption, I assume, for example, that you really exist. I think that's fairly objective. Again, we can play word games and semantic games, but
I'm not playing word games. I'm asking straightforward questions, and you are dodging them.
No, you've gotten to this whole thing about the word assumption. Let me look it up right now in the dictionary and see if it's necessarily subjective. If it is, I will apologize for using the wrong word.
It's not that the word assumption was the problem here.
Well, that's what you kept talking about. A thing.
No, sir. If you'd let me finish, when you say based on an assumption, your foundation, see, when you say, hey, this is based on evidence, that's objective. When you say based on my assumption, that is subjective.
But what assumptions does science make?
I'll change my word. So I apologize to you for a bad word choice, and I will use a word that more effectively communicates with you what I mean. That if someone knows about the soul and therefore sees all beings as equal in that sense and deserving of moral consideration and acts in a way consistent with that view, that would be a symptom of higher consciousness than someone, let's say, who is a misanthrope. Further, that behavioral definition is something which is available, let's say, to the public, but ultimately, for those who are within the spiritual science, it's possible to see different levels of spiritual attainment to those. It's just like within the field of science, scientists know who advanced scientists are. And
oh, sorry, I thought you're done.
No, go ahead.
Well, you said someone who knows about the soul and considers all people equal. So what if somebody considers all people equal but doesn't know about the soul, like me?
I'd say you're a good person.
But am I saintly?
If you really show extraordinary empathy And I mean,
but isn't that just like your view of what saintly is? What if my view of saintly is different? How can we tell which of us is right?
well, first of all, you really don't think that to be saintly is to be kind and compassionate?
I honestly find saintly to be a repugnant word that doesn't have a good definition, that much like spiritual and others can be passed around to mean pretty much anything, which is why I'm asking for an objective definition of saintly. And instead, you just keep telling me what you think saintly is, because
I'm just, Matt, I'm just trying to be conversational. I don't want to keep saying, I know this, I know that. And so you can, if you want to be like extremely demanding that I can't use any type of casual language, then I'll have to shift.
That's not what okay. If you're going to keep pretending that I'm objecting to casual language, all I'm doing is asking questions and asking for you, who've already acknowledged that you are not in favor of subjective truth, to talk about objective truth. And since we're supposed to be having a conversation about epistemology, which is a path that we both agreed on, some path to objective truth, I'm asking about that. I'm asking questions that are within the topic here. And so when you say that somebody is saintly because they know about the soul, well, I don't know about a soul. I don't see any evidence for a soul. I don't see any reason to think there is a soul. And that doesn't keep me from thinking that all humans, whether they have a soul or not, should be considered equal. And so when you say, this is what saintly means, what you're saying is this is what saintly means to me. It's not like there's some objective truth out there to discover about sainthood.
You were a little more open, Matt, to...
Well, that's what all the Christians keep telling me too. So you're in good company there. I'm closed.
A little more open to, I could explain these things. I'm not in the mood of, battling you. I'm trying to explain things. It seems like it's like a boxing match. You're kind of looking for any little opening to throw a punch.
No, I'm looking for epistemology, which is about truth and important. And now you're suggesting that I'm just not open to it and you're not in the mood to explain things. Why did you agree to talk about epistemology? I
am in the mood, but again, this is I'll leave it to the listeners to evaluate who's super combative here.
Sure.
Yeah. Well,
I don't view anyone as saintly. That's the point. I don't see the reason to view someone as saintly.
So let's not use that word anymore. In reply to your question about your own characteristics, as you describe them, your sense that people are equal, there is a state of consciousness described in the Gita, which is, the Sanskrit word is sattva, which is often translated as goodness or virtue. And there aren't theistic requirements for that. In other words, it's not like if you don't believe in this particular God or name of God that you go to hell. In the Gita, there's no punishment for not believing in God. If you, in terms of the notion of karma, if you're a good person, which it seems you are in some ways, if you're the way you treat people, if you're a good person, then that is rewarded regardless of what your religious beliefs or disbeliefs are. It's just a thing of goodness. In terms, you could say, what's extra about someone who is, let's say, advanced in a spiritual science, if it follows, if it's true that there is a God and souls, if that's true, let's say hypothetically, and if it turns out to be the case that to know that is the highest benefit possible for a living being, and to sort of enter into that realm, then to dedicate one's life to helping people to understand that, trying, whoever is interested, is in a sense the best thing that you can do for a person, although there are obviously other good things you can do for them. And so the problem with trying to give you a definition for, well, I won't say saintly because you don't like that word. I don't know, is there a synonym we could use, or like very virtuous, or?
I don't know. This whole thing started because we were talking about how can you demonstrate that? So like, I think everybody hopefully would agree that Richard Dawkins knows more about biology than the average third-year biology student and me.
Yeah.
And that believe this, but we can actually demonstrate it by asking questions, and Dawkins can make this clear to any reasonable person on the planet quickly.
But you see, we're back in the same circularity. And that is you're assuming.
I haven't made the case for.
I'll explain why. Because you're taking empiricism as the universal paradigm that any valid.
No, sir. No, sir. No, sir. I'm taking demonstrably true as the thing that I'm considering. It's not the fault of empiricism or science that your beliefs are not demonstrably true. It's not the fault of empiricism, science, or skepticism that Richard Dawkins can explain how he is a more knowledgeable biologist than me, and you can't demonstrate how someone can demonstrate they're more spiritual than someone else.
You just said the same thing I said. You said it with different words. I'll try to explain it because you're really in the same circularity. You are in physical science, there are methods of demonstration. And you are saying that the way that empirical science demonstrates its claims is the model that every candidate for a knowledge system has to match. In other words, if I claim there's a spiritual science, I have to be just like Richard Dawkins and empirical science. And I've tried to explain to you in many ways why that's irrational.
You keep doing that, but I'm not saying it has to be empirical science. As I explained at the beginning, demonstrable is the thing, not empirical.
But the word demonstrable entails, I don't know if there's a word demonstratee. The word demonstrable entails that there is someone qualified to evaluate a demonstration.
So you're saying nobody's qualified to evaluate this?
No, I'm not saying nobody. I'm saying some people are. Now, you object to the notion. I think you objected. Maybe, again, I misunderstood you. But what you keep saying is that empirical science is the word you used is consistently reliable or more reliable because it is more universally demonstrable. And what I'm saying is that is an assumption on your part. It's not necessarily true because it could be the fact that the lower sciences are more easily demonstrable because they're more common to everyone. And so you are assuming the key point. And here's the circularity. The circularity is that you are assuming that the more universally demonstrable something is, the better a method it is for getting any kind of knowledge. And that's something you assume based on the analogy of empiricism. So that if there's something which is not empirical, it still has to conform to that kind of demonstrability. And
no, sir, as we said at the outset, what it has to conform to is reason. Reason is the prime thing. And what you're doing is saying that there may be some exceptional type of reasoning out there that is just available to a select few and that doesn't conform to demonstrable features that we would expect in any epistemology. You are advocating for an epistemology that cannot demonstrate any reliability.
No, it's not. You see, I mean, thousands of years and billions of people for you is not reliable. The point here is
correct, because thousands of years and billions of people have been wrong about countless things. The truth, the reliability of an epistemology is not in how many people became convinced of it.
But that's what you were just saying, demonstrability.
No, I'm not. Demonstrable is separate from acceptance. The truth doesn't care how many people believe it. Good methods do not care how many people believe it and don't impact on whether you believe it or not. Science doesn't care what you believe at all.
The history of science shows that very smart people were convinced throughout history that certain things were demonstrated to them that turned out to be not true.
And then they changed their mind when it was shown demonstrably that this was not true. Religions don't do that.
So it is not a defect in my system if it's not demonstrated to me that it's not true. You see, what you keep doing is...
you don't understand logical fallacies.
No, so I think what you don't understand is circular reasoning. Because you have...
I'll bet you $1 I do. A circular reasoning is a syllogism in which the conclusion is entailed in the premises.
Okay, assumed. I don't owe you $1 because I don't think you know how to apply it. Here's the point. You keep saying that Dawkins' empirical science is structurally, not content. The content may not be empirical, it may not be physical, but structurally, that is the model. So if anyone comes forward with any claim that I have a knowledge system, you have to do what Dawkins does. You have to show that it's more or less universally demonstrable. And I'm saying that assumption on your part.
That's not a Dawkins thing. That's a science thing. And if you had anything that could demonstrate it, it would, as I pointed out, be included as a science.
I believe, and I'm claiming that that is an irrational demand.
Well, you don't get to claim it's irrational and win points. You have to prove it's irrational.
I'll prove it.
Okay.
Because if something, for example, if I say that I saw a square circle, that's analytically impossible. I did not see a circle. However, what I've said about a spiritual science and the qualifications and who knows and who doesn't know, none of that is logically impossible. And so it's actually, it can't be discarded as simply illogical in a serious sense of the word logic.
I'm sorry, Dr. Resnick, but the fact that something is not logically impossible tells us nothing at all about whether or not it's true. A fallacious argument, the conclusion of a fallacious argument is undetermined. It is not either true or false.
I was just getting started. So if it is not logically impossible, I didn't say I didn't say that my claims are true because they're not logically impossible. That would be a
You haven't given us any reason to think they're true other than that you think they're true.
I think, again, I don't think I've given you reasons, which I didn't expect to do. But my simple point is that it is not logically impossible to say that there is a knowledge system by which whatever appearances may lead you to contrary views, it is possible to have a knowledge system in which people acquire objective, profound spiritual knowledge of spiritual things. And the fact that that knowledge is not demonstrable in exactly the same way, because it is demonstrable, but not in the same relevant way that, let's say, mixing hydrogen and oxygen, or the way that Dawkins demonstrates, your insistence that all claims to knowledge must follow the methodology of empirical science. Even if the content is not empirical, they have to use some kind of methodology which achieves the same level of universal demonstrability. That's simply your opinion.
It's actually not just my opinion. It is the actual philosophical entire system of epistemology. It is studying how do we know what we know. And yes, it is. And let me finish. Among people who are experts in epistemology, if you were to approach them and say, I have my own personal epistemology, and it is not logically impossible for me to be wrong, they would laugh at you.
However, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, that's not all I'm saying. I said that, but so you've taken out a little bit.
You said that. You said that, and then you said you didn't say it. Now you're saying you did say it. If you said that, they would laugh at you.
Yeah, I know many epistemologists that would laugh at what you're saying. So you've got your epistemologist, I've got my epistemologist. I mean, the notion that...
Well, congratulations. Let's just flip a coin about truth. I thought we were here to actually put reason first. But when you say you're going to put reason first, and then you claim that your position is not logically impossible, you haven't told us nothing. Because countless positions could be not logically impossible and still not be true.
That wasn't all he said, though.
I did not base my claim. I did not, again, I'll say it again, because you are like putting out...
You don't need to. We can rewind.
Yeah, I did not say that what I claim is true because it's not logically impossible. That is simply...
Why bring it up then? What was the point of bringing up not logically impossible?
I'll tell you why, brother.
If something is not logically impossible, does that tell us anything at all about whether or not it's true?
Yes.
No, it doesn't.
Well, I'll explain what it tells us. What it tells us is very simple. What it tells us is that on the basis of that we cannot rule it out on the basis of logical impossibility. It doesn't mean we can rule it in. It just means it's like a preliminary check, because if it's logically impossible, it's not even worth investigating. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's likely to be true. It doesn't mean it's probably true. It just means it's just a check you have to go through. Okay, we've eliminated that. Now let's go on to more serious criteria. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, because you can't get to the more serious criteria, so you're going to go with the one that's not going to tell us anything. Whether or not something's logically impossible does not tell you whether it's true or false.
I think we're spending unnecessary time on this. It tells us that it can be true, possibly, so we can rule out it being false and then move on.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't tell you that it can possibly be true. It just tells you that you cannot show that it is logically impossible. That is not the same as showing that it is possible. Both non-possibility and possibility have a burden of proof to demonstrate.
It is shown in this sense.
No, it's not. The fact that something is not demonstrably not impossible does not mean that it's possible.
I'll quote something I believe I heard from you.
Okay.
And I may get you wrong, so if I do, I apologize. And that is, in a situation where I don't know if something is true or not, then my position is, it's not impossible, but it's not necessarily likely or probable. It may not.
You didn't hear that from me, because possibility needs to be demonstrated, as does impossibility.
However, as we go through a checklist of epistemic hurdles or whatever, we are in the process of exploring possibility. And so until I've shown it's impossible, I keep going through the checklist. Now, again, I want to get back to the main point, is that you are assuming that Dawkins and science, or just using him as a symbol, that is the required model, that's the required methodology, no matter what the content is, physical or metaphysical. Anyone that wants to reasonably claim to know something has to adopt that, has to buy into universal demonstrability. And if there's not universal demonstrability, for you, it's ruled out. And I'm saying something cannot be universally demonstrable because there are a lot of unqualified people. That's possible. That something is not universally demonstrable, but it's still true. And it can be demonstrable to some people who have relevant qualifications. That in itself, however you want to fill in content, is not irrational, because it is possible.
Sorry, that's not how demonstrable works. Demonstrable isn't subjective and contingent upon qualifications.
No.
Demonstrable.
I did not present a subjective notion of demonstrability.
You did.
No, I didn't.
You presented a conditional one.
And just as to understand advanced science, it's conditional upon one having certain qualifications.
But I'm not talking about understanding advanced science. I'm talking about whether or not the methodology of science produces accurate results. That's what epistemology is about.
However,
you keep making about what people believe.
No,
what people believe doesn't matter.
I make the same claim for spiritual science. I say that if someone actually goes through the proper methodology, they do get the result. And the fact
calling it spiritual science doesn't make it science.
And saying it's not doesn't make it not science.
It does, because science is predicated on demonstrability.
But again,
science is predicated on demonstrability.
And I'm claiming demonstrability. I'm saying it's a demonstrability which functions under different circumstances with different criteria.
Yes, but that's called special pleading and subjectivity.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it's special pleading. No, it's not. To say that.
Yes, it is. We can do this all day.
It's special pleading if and only if I buy into your completely circular assumption that if empiric demonstrability,
I didn't say empiric. Go ahead.
If empiric demonstrability is the model, it's the paradigm, and I have to be like Dawkins with what I claim to be science.
Oh my God, I'm sorry I ever mentioned him. He's going to hate me for having his name come up so much from you.
Okay. I'll stop using it. If we use, let's say, a reputable scientist, and he's demonstrated something that other scientists are happy with, it's not controversial, then if that in fact is the epistemic model, if you have to do it that way, then and only then my presentation is special pleading. To call what I'm saying special pleading is logically tied to acceptance of the paradigmatic status of the empirical model, which I don't accept. I accept that it's valid, but not universally paradigmatic.
Okay. It would depend on this particular religion. If in fact, like, for example, a religion where people think that there's a guiding principle that gives them advice and conveys information to them, that is something that is testable. It's not necessarily falsifiable about what the origin is, but it could at least demonstrate that it's producing something. And if there was this, sorry, what?
Just give an example so I know what you mean. I want to make sure I understand you.
So what I said is, so I was asked, I thought, if it were in fact true, whatever spiritual belief somebody had, and they were able to demonstrate it, what would that look like? And what I said is, it would depend on what the specific claims of that religion were. And if a particular religion claimed that a Holy Spirit would communicate with you and give you accurate information about others, then that is a testable claim, although the source of it is ultimately unfalsifiable. Or if you could pray and heal people, intercessory prayer, that is a testable claim. It has been tested. It has failed. It hasn't necessarily failed for every religious model, but that is at least testable. If in fact, I don't know, for example, with bhakti-yoga or whatever else, I don't know what the proof would look like, which is why I'm here asking. And all I've gotten is, evidently, you would appear more saintly in whatever definition Dr. Resnick uses.
Okay.
Well, how else could, what would be the truth? What would be the thing that people could look at to see that your view is correct? That's what I asked an hour ago, and we're way over time.
Okay. But again, I think I've answered you many times, but it's not, anyway, it's not working. First of all, when you say testable, let's say, like, I claim that if you do certain religious practices, you'll be cured of diseases or something like that, which is not what I say. I mean, I don't look for material results because it's just not my criteria. But as far as testable, or I would say that, well, not I would say, I mean, it's a fact that I participate within a spiritual community or society in which it's actually very clear to people who is more spiritually advanced, who is, you could say, to use a crude phrase, more God conscious, by certain behavioral symptoms, by certain, we didn't get into self-evident, actually, and I was looking forward to your critique of the notion of self-evident, but, so maybe we could do that. Can we just jump into self-evident?
I thought we were over time.
Oh.
Well, if you need to get going, that's fine. But if you got another 10 or 15, we could cover one more topic.
Yeah, I can do another 10 or 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll just make a quick little claim, and then you can. I think you'll attack it, but my claim would be that there.
Well, I definitely will now. So. I wouldn't want to make you wrong. So I'll definitely attack it now. Bring it on.
That was good. So
I do like to have fun. I realize that things get heated in these, but I bear you no ill will and don't think negatively about you at all. This is all about the issues, and I have fun. But I mean, we're not getting anywhere. So let's go with self-evident.
Okay.
Because I think that it's going to be funny because people in chat are going to be like, it's self-evident that these guys were not going to agree an hour and a half ago.
Okay, I'll make a simple claim that within spiritual practice, one has self-evident or experiences of self-evident truth, which become properly basic as a foundation to build a knowledge system. I hope I'm giving.
I'm not. Maybe I missed it.
Maybe give an analogy or an example.
Okay. Just like actually you mentioned earlier, the the idea that when you're dreaming, then you wake up and you make a quick decision that the world of awake consciousness is somehow ontologically superior to the dream state, although we can't prove that.
And you think that's self-evident?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, which is why when I talked about it, I described the reasons why I find it. Whereas, now, granted, there is a de facto assumption that I am preferring a world that is not absurd. But there are things that happen in the dream world that are absurd and different. And it's not just about like a quality of experience. It would be like, as a thought experiment, could you imagine sitting here, you and I think we're both awake right now, and then you wake up? I mean, as a thought experiment, and it would be bizarre. And I love that. And it's something that never happened. But I don't think it is self-evident. What it is I have evaluated the dream world as best I can. And I've evaluated the thing that I'm not calling dream world, the regular world, as best I can. And one of them can descend into chaos, has no necessary uniformity or structure. And one of them does. And the absurdity of the dream world is the reason why, yes, it's just a preference. I prefer the waking world to the dream world as far as saying which of these two is more real, whatever that means. But I don't consider it self-evident. It is evident based on an examination of the qualities and characteristics of this and a personal preference, which is why when I was talking, well, maybe I didn't talk about it because we kind of skipped past the epistemology notes at the beginning where I talked. I had three main presuppositions, and they were all with R's. I went through all the trouble to get good alliteration, and then there was skepticism, syllogism, scientism, science, etc. But it's not like I could say this is the real world and the dream world isn't real, because on some level, the dream world is also real. It is something that my brain is experiencing. It's just
of course
a construct that doesn't match the physical reality that I'm in. And there are people who identify as spiritual in various ways, who would say that, in fact, this world that I'm experiencing, that we would view as the real world, is real, but the dream world is actually more real. And we only just get to barely touch it because we need to take drugs, or we need to have the right mind, or we need to, hyperventilate into a bag, or we need to meditate for a while. And then we only get little fleeting glimpses of this, but that's the true reality. And for everybody who says that, it's neat that they believe it, but they can't demonstrate it.
Okay, I would say that there is such a thing as lucid dreams, and there are even in the Upanishads there are sages who believe that we get special insights in dreams. That's common in many traditions. I would say, though, defending the self-evident nature of, let's say, awaking, what we call awaking. I mean, I agree. I think there are degrees of being self-evident. I don't think everything I would say that waking up from a dream is sufficiently self-evident, not perfectly so, that in our
all I'm saying is that the thing that you're describing as self-evident is actually based on a comparison within a structure. It's not that it is. I think that we both recognize we generally can tell the difference between when we're awake and when we're dreaming, but not always, which is why there's things like lucid dreaming, and why every now and then I generally don't remember my dreams. I wake up every day as if yesterday or the period where I was asleep didn't happen, with very rare exceptions. On occasion, there might be some nightmare or some weird dream, and I happen to wake up in the middle of it, but I can generally only catch like glimpses of it. And if in fact that was the real world, there's nothing I can do about it. I don't see any way. No, there's no demonstrable path for me to enter and stay in the real world. So whether you call it self-evident or not, it is evident in the sense that it has a quality and characteristics that would lead us into absurdity in a way that the waking world doesn't.
Okay, I agree with that, but in terms
we agree on a lot.
Yeah.
Just logical fallacies and.
Now I just have to learn how to play pool. So, okay, I would say about the dream and the waking that almost everybody takes it as sufficiently self-evident, if not perfectly so, to conduct their life on that assumption. In other words, so that when people wake up, they generally take very seriously, okay, this is my life, and this is what I do, and this is my family, and so on. And so here I'm using self-evident. I think there can be degrees of self-evidence. And so something can be to use an analogy now, let's say to what I call, to your great pleasure, spiritual science, that if
it's right up there with creation science and.
So I would say that for many spiritual practitioners, just as when I wake from a dream, I'm sufficiently convinced that I've really woken up and I'm, let's say, more in a real world than when I was dreaming, despite all some of the, the interesting features of dreams, that therefore I'm going to live my life that way. And so I would say that people have spiritual experiences, and you said something in one. This I knew you definitely said. I know you definitely said you were talking, which I thought was interesting. You said that we don't really know things, but we can really, 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 or I forget the word you used, believe something like, or very, very, very strongly or something.
We can't have absolute certainty, but knowledge, colloquially, when we say we know something, is just an expression of confidence that I believe something so strongly it would be worldview altering to discover I was wrong. Like if I find out I'm in the Matrix, that'd be a shock. But we both know there's no solution to the problem of hard solipsism in the first place. So.
Yes. So I would say that people, because in terms of, is someone being epistemically rational, let's say in taking to this spiritual path, I would say that if it's the case that someone has an experience which is sufficiently self-evident, comparable to, not perfectly so, but analogous to the self-evident nature of waking up from a dream, that just as we conduct our life based on accepting that as some level of self-evident, which is sufficient to go on living my life out in the world, in the same way, people conclude that they had a spiritual experience which is self-evident enough to justify pursuing that path or going further, even if they don't have absolute certainty. And so in that sense, they are being no more irrational than a person that decides to wake up and just live their life not knowing perfectly awake.
So I'm not saying that somebody's irrational for pursuing something that they feel is possible. I'm saying that when we evaluate rational versus irrational, it would be irrational to believe something before there is sufficient evidence to warrant belief. And if we do so based entirely on our personal experience, that is a problem, because we know that our personal experience can be wrong, which is why proper science requires and expects and demands independent confirmation.
And that's exactly what happens in spiritual science, because apart from all your other objections, just focusing on the social nature of knowledge, that let's say I had a spiritual experience, or I thought I did, I imagined I did, and there really wasn't anyone else that took it that seriously, but when I find that there are, lots of people, lots of very intelligent people, philosophers and all kinds of people, and, for long periods of time that had exactly the same experience, and to me, it was self-evident at the moment, at least, I won't go into degrees of self-evidence, but sufficiently self-evident, not simply to say that's interesting, but that this is a serious possibility or even likely, and I definitely want to pursue this. And if I can repeat this experience, if I can have similar experiences within a certain type of metaphysical causality, which makes sense to me, which is rational to me, then I am justified in pursuing this path.
All right, so we made it 15 minutes, and then I heard the term metaphysical causality, and that is a door that we're going to keep closed for today.
All right. Cool. I guess we'll wrap it up here. Any final points?
No, I don't want to,
No, other than I will say this. So there's a recording. Things got heated. There was different agreements. There were accusations about my character. There were accusations about whether or not you're honest. There was accusations about who does or doesn't understand logic or whatever else. That all aside, there were some assholes in chat who I want nothing to do with, despite the fact that they were ostensibly on my side. And I don't bear any of you guys any ill will, and would be happy to have other conversations, although maybe slightly shorter and a little more focused. But I'm good.
Thank you very much. And I actually appreciate that you took your time. I know you have a lot of things you do. I enjoyed speaking with you, and it'd be a pleasure to talk to you again.
All right, cool. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more of these conversations. We've got Josh Wolf next week having a debate with Tom Jump on atheism is an overreach. That should be interesting. And we've got other videos which we put out too. Be sure to hit the like button, and there's been lots of comments, but if you're watching this after the recording, you can leave comments and let us know what you think. And I'll see you next time. Hare Krishna.